Can my homeless application be cancelled if I want to go back and live with my parents? This is a question we've had coming through one of the YouTube video comments section, and I thought it's a really interesting one to pick apart a little bit because it's not quite as simple as it might sound, and there's some things you can do. If you're not careful, you're going to end up in a worse position. So I'll hopefully give some pragmatic kind of tips about what you might do in this situation. It might sound like an unusual situation. Obviously, lots of people fight to get into temporary accommodation, but what can happen is once someone's in temporary accommodation, life can change. You know, it might be that first of all, your temporary accommodation is not very nice. It might be in a difficult location, and it may well be that, you know, maybe the relationship with your family improves and they're happy for you to go back and live with them, which sounds like it's the case here. Now, in order to explain this kind of answer properly, I need to explain a little bit of technicalities around the Housing Act, and there's two sections that are relevant here. One is section 188, which is essentially the duty to provide temporary accommodation if a council has reason to believe you might be homeless, might be eligible and might be in priority need. They'll then put you in temporary accommodation whilst they carry out the inquiries, and they'll reach a decision, and that can take at least 2 months, if not many more. And then when they reach a decision, and let's say the decision, just to keep it simple, is that they have found that you are in priority needs and you're not intentionally homeless, you're then accommodated under section 193 of the Housing Act. So they haven't housed you in your final home yet. They're essentially keeping you in probably the same temporary accommodation often whilst you work your way out the bidding system or find private rented accommodation or whatever, something like that. Now, the reason I'm explaining this is that which duty you're under at the time will slightly affect what the answer is. I guess the first thing to say is that either way, it's in the council's interest for you to move in with your parents. It means that they save temporary accommodation stock. It means they have one less person on the housing register potentially, depending on what the circumstances are. I'll talk about that in a minute. But equally, and call me a cynic, it's also in their interest to effectively catch you out. I know housing officers who will wait for someone to do this, and then they'll essentially say, "Oh, you've turned down our offer of accommodation or our offer of assistance. You've made a decision to go and live with your parents, and potentially there's this danger that if the relationship with the family broke down within a short period of time, and you went back to that local authority, they might say, "Oh, we were going to help you. You chose not to take it, and therefore we're not going to help you now." Now, that's a pretty shitty way of doing things, but that does happen sometimes. So I'm just to explain kind of a few things you want to bear in mind when you are in this situation. Now, part of this is going to depend on the circumstances of the family's accommodation. If you're moving into accommodation which is overcrowded already, and maybe you don't have a bedroom, you're sleeping on a sofa, that doesn't sound to me like the sort of accommodation that's going to last for any particular length of time. And in one sense, there would be a danger that if you went back to accommodation like that and then tried to reapproach the council down the line, they might say, well, you've knowingly worsened your situation. You chose to move into accommodation which was not suitable for you, and so forth. So one of the things to really kind of bear in mind here is, and it's just a question for yourself really, is if I'm going to take an alternative housing option, how viable is that? How plausible is it that it's going to be a long-term option? Obviously, no one can tell the future, and obviously things change, and that those things are out of your control sometimes. But ultimately, if you're going to make a decision like this, you probably want to make sure that you have got a good prospect of remaining in that accommodation for a long period of time, just to make this kind of make sense for you. The next thing you want to do is you really, really, really want to pin down your housing officer in an email trail and specifically put a series of questions to them in writing and get answers from the housing officer before you actually decide to do anything. And really, that email trail is going to firstly explain to the housing officer what the nature of the accommodation you're going to move into is. So as I say, there is whether or not there's a bedroom waiting for you, whether or not you're going to afford the rent if your parents are going to charge you rent, how many people are in the property, all those kind of things. It's just so the housing officer can gauge whether this is accommodation that's going to have a reasonable prospect of continuing for a significant period of time. The next thing you want to do once you've done that is you want to specifically ask the question, what happens if the relationship breaks down within a short period of time, or in fact a long period of time, and you have to reapproach the same local authority in the months or years to come? Because what you really want to make sure the answer to that is that, yeah, we're okay, we're satisfied that you're making a sound decision now to move in with your parents. It's a good, it's a sensible decision. You're doing it in good faith. And should that relationship break down in the coming months or coming years, we would be able to take a fresh application from you, and the decision to move in with your parents now is not going to be used against you. Essentially, that's the kind of thing you want. You want that kind of assurance in writing. You know, forget the phone call, forget what they say on the phone. Only take what they say in writing has actually been important. But that's what you want, so that if down the line things don't work out, you can reapproach the same council, and they will recognise the fact that actually, you know, you tried your best to find alternative accommodation before, and it just hasn't worked out. It's not your fault. It's not because of, you know, kind of foolishness or kind of, you know, whatever. So that's the kind of the main message I want to say here, is that you really want to make sure you've got written confirmation from a housing officer that it is not going to come back and bite you in the arse in a few years' time or a few months' time. But the other thing to say here, and this is where it gets slightly more interesting, if you were in temporary accommodation and you said to a housing officer, you know, look, I'm in temporary accommodation, I don't like it for whatever reason, my family are okay with me remaining there in the short term, and effectively treating that accommodation as if it was temporary accommodation, then in one sense it's very much in the housing officer's kind of interest to say, yep, okay, that makes sense to us. You know, you can continue to remain in your parents' home. Technically you're still homeless, you know, because we're saying that actually that isn't a long-term housing option, but ultimately you can stay there long enough for you to bid on properties and win bids and move somewhere else. There's nothing saying that you can make the council kind of take that stance, but as I say, it's in their interest to do so. And I think with that, I guess it's just very important, again, just to spell that out in an email trail. And ultimately, and this is something which, again, you know, a good housing officer will not have a problem with, is for the housing officer to say, look, you know, it suits us for you to move in there. Should the relationship break down, you know, dramatically, or, you know, kind of in a short period of time, come back to us and we will find you alternative temporary accommodation. Because as I say, it saves them money by you not being in TA. But also potentially, if that is not a long-term housing option because you are sleeping on a sofa or something like that, and it's, you know, it's better than the TA, but it's not great, you want to make sure that, you know, your homeless application continues. They reach a decision, they get you onto the housing register, you start bidding, and you're able to win bids. You know, and that process means that you ultimately you are going to be able to have your own place at the end of it. You've saved the council a bit of money. The downside of doing this is that councils, and I think this is just, you know, probably quite widespread, they tend to deal with their customers on the basis of who's costing them the most money. So there's a danger if you turn down temporary accommodation in this way. So, you know, there's an offer of temporary accommodation there, you say, no thanks, I'm going to stay with my family. There's a danger that essentially you'll just stay on the bottom of the pile because you're not priority for them. They don't really care. You're essentially, you know, you're not costing them any money by staying in their parents, and so there's this kind of danger that you'll just get lost in the paperwork, really. So for that reason, it's kind of you probably want to be a little bit careful about how you kind of make those decisions. And there's nothing that's actually going to tell you that's how it works. So in one sense, it's something we see a lot of time in the case what we do around Bedford, where, you know, someone turns down temporary accommodation, and then because housing officers have got such large caseloads, they just don't really, or they stop being motivated to get that person through temporary accommodation into their final accommodation. So that's just something to bear in mind. It does lead on to another video I'm going to do, which talks about Part 6 applications, so where you're applying just to the housing register, and Part 7 applications where you're approaching as a homeless person. So hopefully I can kind of make a bit more sense of that in that video. But yeah, hopefully that all makes sense. Hopefully it's helpful. The key thing, as I say, is if you're going to make any decision like that to kind of you know, leave temporary accommodation, you make sure before you do it, and really has to be before you do it, the housing officer has confirmed with you that it's not going to kind of harm your rights down the line.